The French are a unique people. Unique in the sense that they claim that France is the mother of modern day revolution, with the French Revolution in 18th century. Liberté, fraternité. That was France during the revolution, and that they exported this revolution to the world. Yet somehow, France is the worst of the colonizers from all objective assessments. Of course, Samora Moises Machel said it is wrong to categorize slave makers as one being better than the other, but permit me to say that they were the worst. Number one, unlike the British, who simply were interested in your resources and therefore engaged in what was called direct rule, the French wanted to assimilate you. So their policy was assimilation. They came to the colonies and they wanted to convert you into Frenchmen and French women. And in school parades in the colonized parts of the world by the French, like Senegal, like Mali, like Burkina Faso, which was then Upper Volta, like Togo and Benin and Suriname. During the parade in the morning, pupils used to recite our ancestors, the Gauls. A black pupil saying that their ancestors were the Gauls. They wanted you to speak French. And once they had picked a few of you and took them to the Sorbonne, you had to be a total Frenchman or a total Frenchwoman. They came to different parts of the world and they created what they call the Petit Paris. Abidjan is Petit Paris, the small Paris. And their colonies were actually called overseas territories, les territoires du Haute-Mer. They called them overseas territories being administered from the metropole. The French never intended to leave. They never intended to leave Suriname. They never intended to leave Vietnam. They never intended to leave Senegal or Mali or Guinea-Conakry, and they were vicious. They punished you. They humiliated you. They did not want you to speak your language. I do not know why they were that harsh. Perhaps it's because of their history. Remember, this is a country that had kings. This is a country that had Marie Antoinette. This is a country that had King Louis XVI, and there was a time, it is King Louis XIV, who at one time when he was asked, and what is the state? I think that is that experience. King Louis XIV, when they were controlling France, he was asked, and what is the state? He said, l'état, c'est moi, I am the state. And when later King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette came, the French were humiliated when the people asked where we want bread. They say, why don't they eat cake? And I think that history, that pain, when they created the revolution, I think in 1789, and they created the revolution, France was humiliated during the war by the Germans, and when therefore they became colonialists, they were visiting this pain upon the world. And as early as 1958, as recently as 1958, when they recalled Charles de Gaulle to come and take over power in 1958, remember when Charles de Gaulle came, this was a military general. This is the height of decolonization. He used military force in order to retain the French colonies. And the colonies is what made France what is. So that the France that you see now is a France that is built on the back of those colonies. They were harsh because their very survival depended on these colonies. And their harshness can be seen when, on the eve of independence in African countries, they signed the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. The yes-no vote for French colonies to decide whether after so-called independence they would retain connection and connectivity with Paris. They gave everybody the opportunity to vote yes or no, but they did not want you to vote no. So that when Guinea voted no under Ahmed Sékou Touré, when they were leaving, they destroyed everything that was capable of being destroyed. Modibo Keïta, in what was then the French Sudan, now Mali, they destroyed everything. Algeria, the pogrom in Algeria, when they were leaving, then led by Ahmed Ben Bella, they destroyed everything. The other countries, they continue to control. As we speak, the currencies of all former French colonies are still printed in France, CFA franc. Their cruelty, I think, comes out of a big psychological burden, which they visit, transfer of aggression. It is painful. You can see even as we speak during the coup d'etats in Africa, the arrogance. You tell a country which is equal in international law that we have accredited our ambassador, we do not care. France, the home of revolution, the home of coup d'etats at one time, can not recognize a revolution when it's taking place, and they say, accept our ambassador. We don't accept the revolution. That is France for you. Arrogance. The most arrogant of the colonial powers. You know, the history of France is the history of how the arrogance fall. Is, if you allow me, the school bully who takes lunch from every little boy and little girl thinks that he is invincible. Then one day, the little boy says, today you are not taking my lunch. And what the little boy does is to hit you when you did not expect. And you find yourself on the ground and everybody is laughing at you. France did not see what is happening in West Africa coming. So they find themselves at a time when they are very weak economically, when at home the population of immigrants is growing bigger and bigger. You go to cities such as Marseille, you find Algerians, you find Moroccans, you find Senegalese, you find Guineans, you find Burkinabe, and things are not happening as they used to be. Then, in the former colonies that you thought you are controlling, a breed of young men and women begin rising. They rise in Guinea-Conakry, and the first thing they do is they say, we abolish all the agreements that exist between us and France. They rise in Burkina Faso, and they say the same thing. They rise in Mali, and they say the same thing. They rise in Niger, which has been providing you with uranium. Now you can't take it. I think they cannot take it because they are losing food which has been inside of their mouth, and they do not know how to behave. As somebody once said, without Africa, there is no France. Without our former colonies, give France only 20 years, and it will be one of the poorest nations in the continent of Europe. And that is going to happen. And they are resisting because for them this is life and death. But the stars, which I can now perfectly read, are telling me that their goose is cooked, and very well cooked. The story of South America or Latin America or Central America is unique. Unique in the sense that most of the people who now occupy Latin America are all not indigenous to Latin America. The Arawakans and the mestizos who are indigenous, they are very few and far between. Whether you go to Mexico, you'll find them, but they are very few. The Aztecs and their descendants, very few. If you go to places such as Nicaragua, the Aborigines are very few. You go to Mexico, they are very few. So that if you go to many of these places, go to Brazil, for example, which has one of the largest black populations anywhere in the world, over 133 million. And of course, there are very many people of Portuguese origin and people from different parts of the world. So these are all immigrants who have in large integrated and to the extent that is possible, even being racist, it does not make sense. You see quite some integration there. The same is true in Colombia. We now have even the vice president of Colombia is African. The same is true of Honduras. The same is true largely of Chile. And we have, of course, we have seen recent problems in Peru because of you remember Peru, even at one time their president was somebody of Japanese origin, Alberto Fujimori, who was from Japan. But there is one unique Latin American country that we don't talk about, Argentina. Argentina deliberately decided to whiten the population. So most of the coloreds and blacks in Argentina were eliminated. But the point is that Latin America underwent several problems. You remember there was a time when coup d'etats were the thing in Latin America, whether it was in Brazil, it was a military government, whether it was in Uruguay, coup d'etat, in Argentina, coup d'etat, Honduras, coup d'etat, Chile, coup d'etat, Peru, coup d'etat, in Central America, Nicaragua, coup d'etat, Panama, coup d'etat, Costa Rica, civil war until 1948, Mexico. And I think there was a period when, after the coup d'etats and after the activities of revolutionaries such as Simón Bolívar and Ernesto Che Guevara, even in places such as Venezuela, there was a period of settlement. And I think that is largely why Latin America has its own race problems, but they are not as pronounced as they are pronounced in other parts of the world. People suffered together. And I think when you suffer together, there is a sense in which some camaraderie begins to emerge. And that, in a very simplistic way, in my view, explains why indeed there is some kind of understanding amongst the races. Of course, when you go deeper inside, there'll always be people who feel, oh, we are not being treated right, things are not right, but largely people coexist. And we have seen that over a long period, even in areas where you thought that there would be problems in the political arena, in the economic arena, you have fairly reasonable representation. Latin America's history must also be understood in the context of the revolutionary spirit. And when there was a bipolar world, and I want to explain Latin America in the following ways, that if you look at Brazil, for example, which was colonized by Portugal, which was one of the weakest and poorest nations in Europe, there was a time when Portugal actually depended on Brazil in the 1900 and in the mid 1990s, when Portugal itself had had coups. You remember in the 60s, the coup that was mounted against Marcelo Caetano by Antonio de Spinola until 1977, when I was myself a primary school child, and I knew that there was instability. So these countries freed themselves very early, and they did not want to be like Europe. They did not want hard-nosed capitalism like Europe. They wanted societies that were a little bit more egalitarian. So you can see that through the policies of Brazil in those early days. And if you go to places like Chile, when the revolution started taking place, you see people like Salvador Allende. When Allende was in power, Allende was a socialist. And of course, he was murdered almost 30 years ago from this year. And then the Americans imposed Augusto Pinochet. And we can also remember the socialist movement in Argentina during the period of Juan Perón. And socialism was also the way to go in those days. And then if you look at what we now call the Bolivarian republics, Venezuela, which led to people like Hugo Chavez. You look at Bolivia, to Rios. You look at Panama, Omar Rios, who was a socialist. And you look at Nicaragua with Ortega. And so you can see a Latin America that very early on was very different. They say, we think when you are socialist, you take care of social welfare things. You take care of education, you take care of health, you take care of these basic things. And I think that that is now serving them well. A little country such as Costa Rica with a population of 5 million has free healthcare, free education. And what do they have to export? Is just bananas and tourism. 1948, they don't even have an army. They abolished an army. And you remember that in the early days, I think it is in the early 1900s, mid-1900s, they entered into the Rio de Janeiro Pact, which says that if you attack anyone who is the Rio de Janeiro Pact, then you attack all. So a combination of factors made Latin America very different. The Americans always wanted to treat Latin America as their backyard. And they feared, of course, that socialism during the days of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union was in Cuba, Soviet Union was everywhere. So there was always this resistance. And people hated the capitalists in Latin America. And that is why those who claimed to be socialists were in ascendance. And when government settled, they did not ignore what are socialist policies. And that continues even as they suffer here and there to serve them reasonably well. That is not to say that you don't have problems in Nicaragua, or that you don't have problems in Peru, or that you don't have problems in Bolivia, or that you don't have problems in Colombia or Uruguay or Argentina. You do. But the orientation of Venezuela, the orientation is socialist, but the intermeddling of America is ever present. You know, when you don't obey America, they want to ensure that you fail. And they do that quite well.